The night of June 5th, 1944, 12:48 in the morning, in the darkness over Normandy, 13,000 American paratroopers hurtle toward Earth through storms of anti-aircraft fire. Each man carries between 125 and 150 pounds of equipment strapped to his body. Most have never seen combat, and they're about to land scattered across dozens of miles of enemy-occupied France, far from their intended objectives. Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte watches from the ground. Commander of the elite 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, German paratroopers who'd fought in Crete, Russia and North Africa, he considers his unit among the finest formations in all of Western Europe. A decorated veteran with years of airborne experience, von der Heydte has prepared his defences with meticulous precision. Aircraft observation posts covering every approach. Anti-aircraft guns arranged in 360-degree patterns, entire fields, planted with wooden poles Rommel's asparagus, designed to shred incoming gliders. Marshlands deliberately flooded to create death traps. He finishes a late dinner and shaves carefully. In order to appear respectable going into a possible battle, he would later explain. The consummate professional, preparing for what he assumes will be a manageable tactical problem. What von der Heydte doesn't know, what the entire German High Command doesn't understand, is that Adolf Hitler himself has convinced his generals that the age of successful airborne operations is over. According to General Kurt Student, Hitler and the Luftwaffe command were so thoroughly convinced that large-scale parachute assaults were obsolete that they believed not even the enemy would attempt them anymore. Germany's costly victory at Crete in 1941 had taught Hitler never to risk paratroopers on that scale again. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Wehrmacht is about to learn how catastrophically wrong they are, but the irony runs deeper than simple miscalculation. What's about to unfold over the next 72 hours will prove that American chaos can be deadlier than German order. That 13,000 men, dropped in the wrong places at the wrong times with scattered equipment, can accomplish something the finest military minds in Europe thought impossible. This is the story of how the worst airborne drop in history became one of its most devastating successes. To understand the German reaction to the American airborne assault, you must first understand what they believed they knew. By the spring of 1944, Germany had dominated Western Europe for 4 years. After defeating France in 1940, Britain had been too weak to intervene on the continent. In 1942 and 1943, Anglo-American forces concentrated on North Africa and the Mediterranean, making a return to Northern Europe impossible. But now, with invasion clearly imminent, Germany's already stretched armed forces faced the prospect of another major front. The outcome would be decisive. In Führer Directive No. 51, issued on November 3, 1943, Hitler warned of consequences of staggering proportions if the Western Allies gained a foothold. His ambition was brutally simple: reinforce the Western defences, launch a furious counterattack, and throw the Allies back into the sea. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was hand-picked to lead the defence of Normandy. He began fortifying the Atlantic Wall with additional machine gun bunkers, millions of beachfront landmines, and by flooding inland marshes, specifically to trap Allied paratroopers. Rommel's strategic preparations would ultimately help inflict terrible Allied casualties. In fact, if Hitler had listened to all of Rommel's recommendations positioning elite panzer divisions close to the French coastline, the invasion might have ended in disaster. But Hitler disagreed, keeping most panzer divisions near Paris and spreading the rest along the southern French coast. For the German forces stationed in the Cotentin Peninsula, the right flank of the invasion zone, the situation seemed manageable. Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben's 709th Infantry Division held the coastal front. Major General Wilhelm Fally's 91st Luftlande Infantry Division sat in reserve in the centre of the peninsula. The 91st was newly formed, activated only in January of 1944, with replacement personnel from the Baumholder area. With just 7,500 men by June, it was under strength and inexperienced. but the 91st had been significantly reinforced. Attached to it was von der Heydte's 6th Parachute Regiment, 3,400 elite Fallschirmjäger who would grow to 4,500 men by D-Day. Also attached was the 100th Panzer Replacement and Training Battalion, armed with captured French light tanks. Von der Heydte's assessment of his own forces bordered on pride. 1/3 of his officers, and about 1/5 of his non-commissioned officers, were battle-tested paratroopers, some veterans of Crete, Russia, and North Africa. His regiment had an average age of 17.5 young men, but volunteers, aggressive and physically fit. The special missions assigned to parachute troops required soldiers who were not just trained but psychologically prepared for the unique demands of airborne combat. Upon reaching the ground, they had to act instantly according to circumstances, unafraid of close combat, trained in both their own and enemy weapons. His opinion of other German forces in France? Far less charitable. Von der Heydte wrote bluntly that the troops available for defence were not comparable to those committed in Russia. Their morale was low. The majority of enlisted men and non-commissioned officers lacked combat experience. The officers were mainly those who, because of lack of qualification or on account of wounds or illness, were no longer fit for service on the Eastern Front. But his paratroopers were different. They were elite. They were prepared. The German High Command assigned von der Heydte's regiment, a defensive area 20 kilometers wide and 15 kilometers deep, double the normal frontage. This assignment reflected almost limitless trust in Fallschirmjäger combat power, because this position secured the overland entrance to Cherbourg, one of the most strategically vital ports in France. Von der Heydte kept his men busy in the months before the invasion. In addition to usual patrols and nighttime aircraft scouting assignments, he ordered regular exercises. According to battle instructions from General Eugen Meindl, issued on May 11, 1944, 1/3 of the year, troops had to be in position day and night in possible landing zones. The goal was for the Fallschirmjäger to become accustomed to the Norman terrain, to improve their use of natural and man-made defensive positions. The Germans knew the Allies were coming. Even the lowest-ranking Wehrmacht soldier knew the invasion would happen eventually. The only questions were where and when. German planners determined the most likely invasion point was Calais, the closest landing point from England. The English Channel was a tough, choppy sea with notoriously bad weather. A more distant location could put a substantial invasion force at serious risk. The troops manning the Atlantic Wall were reasonably confident that Normandy was relatively safe. This confidence extended to airborne operations. Hitler's conviction that large-scale parachute assaults were obsolete had filtered down through the command structure. When British and American paratroopers attacked Sicily in July of 1943 and proved the contrary, the Wehrmacht itself was no longer in a position to carry out similar operations. The main essential superiority in the air was lacking. The Luftwaffe could no longer match Allied air forces, couldn't assemble enough planes to achieve necessary local air superiority, and couldn't maintain it for the required duration. So, when von der Heydte and his ground observers spotted approaching enemy transport planes at 7 minutes past midnight on June 6th, he assumed he was witnessing a limited tactical operation, a feint, perhaps, or a reinforced reconnaissance. He had no idea he was about to face the largest airborne operation in history. 432 C-47 transport aircraft, carrying 6,928 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, began their drops between 12:48 and 1:40 in the morning. The Screaming Eagles jumped first, organized into 10 serials, each serial consisting of multiple aircraft in formation. Minutes earlier, Pathfinder Team's 300 specially trained paratroopers had jumped ahead of the main force. Their job was to deploy Rebecca, Eureka transponder radar systems, and set out holophane marking lights. The Rebecca, an airborne sender-receiver, would indicate on the pilot's scope the direction and approximate range of the Eureka responder beacon on the ground. In theory, this system would guide the main force directly to designated drop zones. In theory. The first flights inbound to Drop Zone A weren't surprised by the deteriorating weather forecasters had warned of cloud cover and turbulence. But navigating errors combined with lack of Eureka signals caused the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment to come down on the wrong drop zone entirely. Most of the remainder of the 502nd jumped in a disorganized pattern around an improvised drop zone set up by pathfinders near the beach. The Division's parachute artillery experienced one of the worst drops of the operation, losing all but one howitzer and most of its troops as casualties. Then the 82nd Airborne followed another 6,400 men of the All-American Division, so named because it drew soldiers from every state in America. Unlike the 101st, which had never made a combat jump before D-Day, the 82nd were veterans. They'd fought in Sicily and Italy before moving to Britain to prepare for Overlord. Just under half its men had combat experience. The 82nd's drop was, if anything, worse than the 101st's. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment made the most concentrated jump of the night, landing relatively close to Drop Zone O northwest of Sainte-Mère-Église. The Pathfinders had done their job there, and the C-47 pilots negotiated the troublesome cloud bank successfully. But the 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry regiments, assigned to land west of the Murderette River, were scattered catastrophically. Only 4% of the men in these two regiments landed in the correct location. One element of the 507th dropped near Montebourg, miles from their objective. Another landed south of Carentan. The remainder fell astride the Murderette River, east of the drop zone. The 508th was likewise scattered across the countryside, the bulk dropping east of their assigned zone. Some personnel landed as far as 9 kilometers south of Cherbourg. What caused this disaster? Several dozen aircraft were hit by anti-aircraft fire and exploded in flight. Others crashed before paratroopers could exit. Pilots broke formation and turned on the green jump lights even before reaching the drop zones, desperate to escape the walls of flak. The planes bucked like crazy horses. Tracers were so thick they looked like solid barriers of flame. Paratroopers described the experience in stark terms. One remembered, "When I cleared the door, the plane was bucking like a crazy horse, and the tracers were so thick it looked like a wall of flame." Another, "The plane started bucking and jumping, and as my fellow paratrooper fell down, the green light came on. They were all jumping, and he was scrambling trying to get out the door, so I grabbed him and pitched him out." After leaving the aircraft, they faced the descent. "With the roar of the engines in my ears, I was out the door and into the silence of the night," one soldier recalled. But that silence was deceptive. They were sitting targets all the way down. As we left the plane, we had flak, machine gun fire and everything else all the way down because we were sitting ducks. The opening shock was violent. Helmets were pushed over faces. Equipment tore away. One paratrooper felt his .45 pistol and canteen rip from his body during the opening shock. Another watched his rifle tear from his grasp, thinking it might hit some. German soldier and bash in his head. One man's leg pack containing all his equipment except a trench knife and a canteen broke loose and plummeted to earth, never to be seen again. Then came the landings. Many paratroopers fell into the marshes Rommel had deliberately flooded. Men drowned in less than a metre of water, their 100-pound equipment loads pulling them under. One survivor from the 101st Airborne remembered, "Those who jumped from the C-47 before me drowned in a marsh, just like those who jumped after me. I landed on a thin strip of land a few meters wide that crossed the marshes." Bodies would be found there weeks later. Paratroopers who'd survived the jump only to drown in shallow water because they couldn't shed their equipment fast enough. By dawn on June 6th, approximately 2,500 American airborne troops had become casualties. In the 82nd Airborne alone, 15 of 16 battalion commanders in the infantry regiments were killed or wounded. Only about 30% of the 82nd Airborne's forces were under organized unit control by nightfall. For any conventional military operation, this would spell total, catastrophic defeat. But D-Day was not a conventional operation, and here the profound irony begins to reveal itself. The very dispersal that should have doomed the American paratroopers became their most devastating tactical advantage. German forces in the Cotentin Peninsula that night consisted of identifiable units with clear command structures and defined defensive sectors. The 709th Infantry Division held the coast. The 91st Luftland Division covered the interior. Von der Heydte's 6th Parachute Regiment held the area around Carentan. On paper, the Germans possessed everything needed to crush an airborne assault: prepared positions, interior lines of communication, elite troops mixed with adequate reserves. Then the reports started flooding in. American paratroopers landing near Sainte-Mère-Église. American paratroopers 15 miles southwest near Raids. More Americans were detected near Carentan, and Montebourg, and Picoville, and Angoville Plain, and a dozen other locations scattered across 40 miles of countryside. Von der Heydte's communications officer later described the chaos of that night. The communications situation was anything but clear. We couldn't get any connection to the neighbouring units or senior positions. Partisans and sabotage groups had cut the wires, so we had to send out messengers and maintenance men to establish contact. One of my messengers, a young boy who had just turned 18, returned to me in the morning, distraught. I had sent him to the headquarters of the 91st Airborne Division. He found the headquarters deserted and destroyed. He had found the commander of the division, General Falley, lying shot dead on the side of the road. At that point, at the latest, it became clear that we only had ourselves to rely upon in the next few days. Wait. The divisional commander? Dead? General Wilhelm Falley had heard the roar of thousands of Allied aircraft engines in the night sky. He turned his car around and raced back to his headquarters near Bernaville. As he pulled onto the grounds just before dawn, he drove directly into a blaze of gunfire from scattered American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division. He became the first German general to die in Normandy, killed not by a planned ambush or coordinated assault, but by a small group of lost American paratroopers who happened to land near his headquarters, a headquarters they didn't even know existed. This pattern repeated across the entire drop zone. At 4 a.m, German forces near Raids engaged American paratroopers. After an exchange of heavy fire, the Germans defeated the invaders and took prisoner a major, a captain, a lieutenant, and 73 enlisted men, a clear tactical victory. But the prisoners' stories made no sense. They were young men, mostly around 20 years old, big, strong. They wore combat uniforms with sewn-on pockets carrying what seemed like half a department store, rations in cans, chewing gum, chocolate, reserve ammunition, pictures of girls, even explosives. Each had a large combat knife tied to his lower leg. They claimed to be part of massive airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, with thousands of men. But where were these thousands? The Germans were fighting scattered groups of 20, 50, maybe 100 men at most. Small bands appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the hedgerows. Obergefreiter Gunther Prignitz of von der Heydte's 13th Company described the first encounter. The 13th Company absorbed the enemy fire and achieved good results against the Americans, who were disoriented by the nighttime landing in an unknown area. Disoriented? Yes, the Americans were clearly disoriented. But something else was happening, something the Germans couldn't quite grasp. At 3 a.m, von der Heydte's 1st Battalion encountered American paratroopers between Saint-Georges-de-Bohon and Rougeville. The Fallschirmjäger engaged and, according to their reports, achieved good results. The Americans seemed confused, vulnerable, yet more Americans kept appearing. Different groups, different locations, no apparent coordination. General Dolman, commander of the German 7th Army, had scheduled a planning war game in Rennes that day, ironically, testing responses to an Allied landing. His division commanders were on the road to Rennes when they got the recall. They spent the morning racing back to their command posts, trying to piece together what was happening. Dolman attempted to organize a large-scale counterattack. He ordered the 709th and 91st Divisions to attack the drop zones from east and west, with von der Heydte's 6th Parachute Regiment attacking from the south. A classic pincer movement, textbook German tactics. But which drop zones? The Americans seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The scattered state of American forces made a unified German response nearly impossible. Von der Heydte later noted that the confusion was so complete, the German leadership's trust in Fallschirmjäger combat power was tested to its limits. His regiment, assigned an area 20 kilometers wide and 15 kilometers deep, now faced an enemy that couldn't be pinned down, couldn't be decisively engaged, and kept appearing in unexpected locations. South of Angoville-au-Plain, Fallschirmjäger wading through reedy marshes were attacked by strong American units. During the night, more American airborne soldiers had landed via parachute, and 150 military gliders had touched down in the area. The Germans suffered heavy casualties trying to fight through the ring of Americans to the southwest. Close combat erupted, near La Barquette. 3 German soldiers were killed. One Fallschirmjäger, Jäger Manfred Vogt of the 4th Company, made gruesome observations about the intensity of these scattered firefights. The chaos was so complete that Germans and Americans found themselves fighting at point-blank range in darkness, neither side certain of the other's strength or position. At 12:48 a.m., the Pathfinders of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division had been the first to land between Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Baupte, and Carentan. Von der Heydte's men were actually the first Germans to identify enemy soldiers landing in Normandy. His ground observers had done their job perfectly, but identifying the enemy and stopping them proved to be 2 entirely different problems. The town of Sainte-Mère-Église became the first test of this new kind of warfare. Only elements of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had landed near their designated Drop Zone O, northwest of the town. Some paratroopers landed directly in Sainte-Mère-Église's town square. A house fire had drawn German soldiers to patrol the streets, and these unlucky Americans were shot as they descended or before they could cut themselves free from their parachutes. Private John Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple. He hung there for more than 2 hours, playing dead, until most of the village was under American control. But Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led a small force that captured the town shortly after 4 in the morning. By dawn, an American flag flew from the town hall. Sainte-Mère-Église, the first town liberated in France. The Germans couldn't believe it. A key crossroads town, taken in darkness by a force that by all accounts should have been shattered and demoralized. At first light on June 6th, the 91st Luftlandedivision's Division's 1058th Grenadier Regiment attacked the city from the north, while the 1057th Regiment, supported by tanks from the Seine, and 100th Panzer Training Battalion attacked from the west. Von der Heydte's Fallschirmjäger held the south. The northern pincer achieved some initial successes, but the Germans failed to recapture the strategic city. Why? The western prong of the attack was hampered because rear elements of the 1057th Grenadier Regiment were themselves attacked by other American paratroopers who had landed behind them and captured bridges over the Murderet River. The regiment was cut in 2. Everywhere the Germans tried to concentrate force, they found Americans in their rear, on their flanks, disrupting communications, ambushing supply columns, appearing where no airborne troops should logically be. Meanwhile, isolated American paratroopers were accomplishing their missions through sheer improvisation. The 101st Airborne's primary objectives were the 4 causeways leading inland from Utah Beach. These narrow, raised roads across flooded lowlands were absolutely critical. If the Germans controlled them, the 4th Infantry Division landing at Utah would be trapped on the beach, unable to move inland, vulnerable to counterattack. Paratroopers of the 101st seized causeways 1 and 2 in the vicinity of Pouperville. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, had actually landed in the 82nd sector. Rather than waste time trying to rejoin his own division, he moved to assault causeways 3 and 4. By 7:30 in the morning, with these causeways secured, the 101st was able to link up with the 4th Infantry Division near Causeway 2 around midday on June 6. The beach landings, which began at 6:30 a.m., encountered fierce resistance. But the German defenders couldn't reinforce their coastal positions because they were fighting paratroopers in their rear. Kampfgruppe Meyer, the sole reserve force for the German LXXXIV Corps, had been deployed inland in the Bayeux sector. Responding to reports just after midnight that Allied paratroopers had landed south of Carentan, General Marx ordered Meyer to clear up the problem. Meyer quickly assembled his grenadiers and was on the road by 3 in the morning, but navigating Normandy's narrow country lanes in darkness proved difficult. The battle group was still on the road at 6 a.m. when the sun came up and the vast Allied invasion fleet came into view off the coast. Soon Marx's corps was under attack everywhere. The 709th Division in the Cotentin, the 352nd Division between Vierville and Colleville-sur-Mer, the 716 Division from Arromanches to Ouistreham. Meyer never cleared up that problem near Carentan. The scattered American paratroopers kept his forces tied down while the main invasion began. The Germans did manage one armoured counterattack that day. The 21st Panzer Division, deployed 20 miles southeast of Caen, reacted quickly to Allied airdrops, fighting sharp nighttime engagements with British paratroopers. As dawn broke and Allies landed on beaches north of Caen, General Marx wanted the 21st Panzer to disengage and drive for the beaches. But the division was under Army Group B Rommel's command, and Rommel wasn't there. He was spending the day at home in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. Marx had to get permission through Rommel's Chief of Staff, Colonel Hans Speidel. The back and forth consumed precious hours. Marx finally received command of the 21st Panzer at noon and immediately ordered it to cross the Orne River, wheel north through Caen, and drive to the sea. The division got as far as the coast before British and Canadian forces stopped its advance. At 9 p.m., with German Lieutenant Rauch still holding his position at water's edge, and General Feuchtinger still deciding what to do next, a great force of aircraft passed overhead. The British were reinforcing their airborne bridgehead east of the Orne with an immense glider, drop 250 craft, their tow planes, and dozens more fighters flying escort. Fearing an Allied airdrop into the division's rear, Feuchtinger ordered Rauch to retreat and rejoin the main body. The 21st Panzer Division's counterattack, the only German armoured attack of D-Day, ended with a retreat. By nightfall on June 6th, the full scope of what had happened was beginning to dawn on German commanders. Despite catastrophic scattering, despite more than 50% casualties in a single night, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne had accomplished many of their objectives. The landings at Utah Beach succeeded with relatively light casualties compared to Omaha. The causeways were secure. Key towns like Sainte-Mère-Église were in American hands. German communications were disrupted. Their reserves were scattered, responding to threats that materialized and vanished like smoke. The Germans, disorganized by the American random drops, no longer knew where to intervene. They were unable to trace the exact outline of positions and objectives. Every field or village could contain 1 or 2 or 20 or 100 Americans, or none at all. Von der Heete's assessment of the American paratroopers began to shift. These weren't the disorganized, inexperienced troops he'd expected. Yes, they were young, around 20 years old, heavily loaded with equipment, but they fought with a determination that surprised him. A German soldier described them. The American paratroopers were mostly young boys around 20, big and strong guys. But that youth belied their effectiveness. When engaged, they didn't break. Scattered and isolated, they still fought. One account noted grimly, "It was no wonder that some of them just exploded under fire from the rifles," referring to the explosives some paratroopers carried in their pockets. The image captured both the material excess of American logistics soldiers so heavily equipped they literally carried explosives alongside their candy bars and the intimate violence of close combat in the hedgerows. The confusion caused by the scattered drop had strategic implications far beyond the immediate tactical picture. Some key German officers, including both Rommel's and Rundstedt's chiefs of staff, interpreted the dispersed airborne landing as evidence that Normandy was merely a feint, a diversionary attack before the real invasion at Calais. This misinterpretation helped prevent a coordinated German response during the critical first hours. Panzer reserves that Hitler personally controlled remained uncommitted. The divisions held in reserve could have deployed in those first hours to devastating effect, but they weren't released until 3 in the afternoon. Hitler had stayed up late into the night and slept in on D-Day. He had to personally authorize release of those divisions, and no one dared wake him. Communication between German units was successfully disrupted, largely by those scattered paratroopers. The Germans resisted fiercely within their defense zones but knew little about the bigger picture. Time worked against them as the Allies advanced, and the chaotic American airborne operation contributed significantly to that German uncertainty. Over the following days, the pattern continued. In order to increase firepower for American soldiers in the Cotentin, the Allies launched operations Keokuk and Elmira at 9 p.m. on June 6 glider reinforcements for the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. Horsa gliders landed on landing zones E and W, cleared as much as possible by engineers during the day. They transported additional troops, anti-tank weapons, medical equipment, ammunition, and radio stations. Insulated from supply routes due to the multiplicity of drop zones and different objectives, the Allies launched new airborne operations on June 7th, starting at 6 in the morning, Operation Freeport for the 82nd and Operation Memphis for the 101st, plus 2 air landing operations for the 82nd. The Americans were doubling down on what should have been a failed strategy, and it kept working. The fight for Carentan became the next major test. Located in the Douve River Valley at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, Carentan was a town of 4,000 people and a crucial road hub between Utah and Omaha beaches. As long as the Germans held it, the 2 American landing sectors couldn't be consolidated. There was real danger that German forces could isolate and destroy troops at Utah Beach. General Maxwell Taylor's 101st Airborne received orders to capture the town. Taylor and his 6,600 paratroopers had landed beginning in the early morning hours of June 6th. Many, including Taylor himself, landed far from their drop zones, scattered onto cow, pastures, orchards, and rivers. Slowly throughout June 6th they regrouped and conquered initial objectives. Now Carentan awaited them. The prize was strategically vital but heavily defended. Von der Heydt's elite 6th Parachute Regiment held the approaches. Any capture of Carentan meant taking Saint-Côme-du-Mont, first a town 3 miles north. A scratch force from the 101st tried on June 6th, but ran headlong into von der Heydt's Fallschirmjäger and failed. On June 8th, Taylor organized a more formal attack. At 4:45 a.m., 2 battalions of the 506th attacked from the north, while the 3rd Battalion of the 501st Parachute Infantry and the 1st Battalion of the 401st Glider Infantry struck from east. The advance was preceded by artillery barrages. Given that American troops had been fighting without proper food or sleep for 3 days, the attack was disjointed. The 5 battalions became intermingled during uncoordinated beliefers, assaults. For most attackers, June 8th was a day of random firefights, defending buildings, intersections, hedgerows. Despite the confused nature of the American attack, the Germans began withdrawing toward Carentan. Lieutenant Eugen Scherer of von der Heydt's 4th Company described the situation. Our battalion's attack progressed well at first, and we rushed immediately into the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne as they landed from military gliders. A gory battle developed. Man against man and group against group. It wasn't possible for the battalion to have unified leadership, as new enemy units kept landing in the middle of our actions. The Germans were experiencing their own version of chaos now. Fresh American units kept arriving by parachute, by glider, overland from the beaches. Von der Heydt's forces, elite as they were, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. On June 10th, the 101st renewed its attack on Carentan itself. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole led his 3rd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, up the causeway approaches. The Germans held strong defensive positions. Cole's men became pinned down in what would later be called Purple Heart Lane. At 6 p.m., German bombers struck one American company, killing and wounding scores. The attack stalled, but Cole reorganized overnight. At 6 a.m. on June 11th, his battalion renewed the attack under cover of a smokescreen. Reinforced by another battalion, hand-to-hand fighting ensued for almost 6 hours. Casualties piled up so rapidly that Taylor had his officers negotiate a truce at noon to collect the dead and wounded. The temporary ceasefire revealed the brutal cost on both sides. Then the fighting resumed. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly until 10:30 that evening, forcing all 3 American battalions to withdraw under cover of artillery and mortar fire. But by late afternoon on June 12th, the Germans had run out of ammunition. Von der Heydte ordered his troops to abandon Carentan under cover of darkness. Around midnight, as the Germans began pulling out, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's artillery pelted the retreating enemy. Supported by airstrikes, 6 hours later his firepower had cleared the town. Snipers continued firing, but jubilant French citizens emerged from hiding to greet the American liberators with bottles of wine that hadn't fallen into German hands. The 101st Airborne had taken Carentan. The link between Utah and Omaha beaches was secure. Von der Heydte's 6th Parachute Regiment, considered one of the best formations in all of Western Germany, had been forced to withdraw by American paratroopers who, just 6 days earlier, had landed, scattered, and disorganized across the Norman countryside. The material and psychological reality of what the scattered paratroopers faced deserves closer examination, because it reveals both the desperation and resourcefulness that defined their success. When American paratroopers jumped into Normandy, each man carried between 125 and 150 pounds of equipment. A typical load included M1942 jump uniform, main parachute and reserve chute, Monet Garand rifle or Monet carbine broken down in a Griswold weapons container, ammunition, grenades, both fragmentation and smoke rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, first aid kit, map, compass, and personal items. Many also carried additional specialized equipment: Bangalore torpedoes for blowing obstacles, demolition charges, extra machine gun ammunition, mortar rounds. One paratrooper remembered his leg pack designed to drop on a 15-foot line below him before landing, breaking loose during the opening shock. Everything in that pack, except what was on his cartridge belt, was lost forever. The violence of the parachute opening was extraordinary. Men described helmets pushed over faces, equipment torn away, violent snapping motions that left necks and backs aching for days. The German gravity knife issued to Fallschirmjäger to cut parachute risers in emergencies had no American equivalent. US. Paratroopers used their jump knives, but cutting away from a parachute while under fire or being dragged by wind was nearly impossible with the American 4-clip harness system. Those who landed in the flooded areas faced a unique horror. The water was often less than a meter deep, shallow enough that a lightly equipped man could wade through easily. But with 100 pounds of gear, paratroopers sank immediately. The weight of equipment pulled them face down into mud. Many drowned within seconds of landing, unable to release their harnesses, unable to get their heads above water. One survivor's account captured the randomness of survival. Those who jumped from the C-47 before me drowned in a marsh, just like those who jumped after me. I landed on a thin strip of inland a few meters wide that crossed the marshes. Pure chance landing 3 feet to the left or right meant the difference between life and death. For those who survived the landing, the immediate problem was isolation. The click-clack of metal crickets, small brass devices issued to paratroopers to identify each other in darkness, echoed through Norman hedgerows all night. 1. Click-clack, challenge. 2 click-clacks, response. The sound became iconic, though its effectiveness remains debated. In darkness, with adrenaline and fear heightened, some paratroopers shot first rather than risk the cricket betraying their position. Small groups formed organically. A lieutenant from one regiment might find himself commanding privates from 3 different companies. Sergeants led men they'd never trained with. In many cases, the highest-ranking soldier present, regardless of unit-assumed command, and moved toward the nearest objective they could identify. This improvisation became a uniquely American strength. German military doctrine emphasized rigid adherence to command structures. When General Falley died and the 91st Division's headquarters was disrupted, subordinate units struggled to operate independently. They waited for orders that never came, sought to re-establish communication with a command structure that no longer existed. American paratroopers, by contrast, adapted. If the officer was dead, the sergeant led. If the sergeant was missing, a corporal stepped up. If no NCOs survived, privates organized themselves and moved toward what they believed were objectives. This wasn't chaos, it was decentralized initiative, born of necessity but enabled by training that emphasized individual competence and small unit tactics. Consider the story of Sergeant Harrison Summers from the 1st Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. On June 6th, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy needed to clear a German coastal artillery installation near 3, Saint-Martin-de-Vareville. He tasked Summers with 15 men to accomplish the mission. Summers, essentially alone, most of his men providing covering fire rather than directly engaging, cleared 15 buildings filled with German soldiers over 4 hours of sustained close-quarters combat. He killed or captured dozens of enemy troops, destroyed artillery positions, and secured the installation. His actions were so extraordinary they seemed implausible, yet they were documented and verified. This pattern repeated across the battlefield. Individual paratroopers and small groups accomplishing missions far beyond what seemed reasonable, driven by training, adrenaline, and the simple reality that there was no alternative. The material abundance American soldiers carried also distinguished them from their German counterparts. German soldiers noted with amazement and sometimes disgust the sheer quantity of equipment and supplies Americans possessed. Chewing gum, chocolate bars, canned rations, pictures, personal items. To German soldiers who'd fought on the Eastern Front, who'd endured Soviet winters with inadequate supplies, who'd seen their logistics networks collapse, this American abundance was psychologically disorienting. It suggested an enemy with resources so vast that individual soldiers could carry luxuries into combat. One German account noted, each of them had a large combat knife tied with a bootlace to their lower leg. This detail, seemingly minor, spoke volumes. The Americans weren't just adequately equipped, they were lavishly equipped, down to individual fighting knives for every soldier. Von der Heydte's forces, elite as they were, struggled with ammunition shortages. On the night of June 10th, von der Heydte radioed his superiors that his men couldn't continue fighting unless they received immediate resupply. The situation had become so desperate that all rifle ammunition was collected from rifle companies and given to machine gun crews. Without aerial resupply by Ju-52 transports that night, the Germans might have had to abandon Carentan's defense earlier. The Americans, meanwhile, were receiving continuous supply from the beaches. Gliders brought anti-tank weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, radio equipment. Naval gunfire support was available on call. Air superiority meant P-47 fighters could strafe German positions at will. This material disparity wasn't lost on German soldiers. They fought with skill and determination, but they increasingly understood they were facing an enemy with effectively limitless resources. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact on German forces extended beyond simple resource disparity. The scattered American drop violated every principle of military logic they understood, yet it succeeded anyway. Major von der Heydte reflecting on the battle later, struggled to explain how forces so poorly deployed achieved their objectives. His regiment, elite, experienced, well-prepared, had been fought to a standstill by American paratroopers, who, by all conventional wisdom, should have been defeated in detail. The German military tradition emphasized concentration of force, unity of command, and clear lines of communication. The Americans had none of these advantages on June 6th. They were scattered, isolated, often leaderless, yet they won. This represented a profound challenge to German military identity. The Wehrmacht saw itself as the inheritor of Prussian military excellence, superior training, superior doctrine, superior will. Individual German soldiers might lack resources, but their training and discipline would compensate, except it didn't. Not in Normandy. Not against an enemy that refused to behave as enemies should. In the weeks following D-Day, as fighting continued across Normandy, German soldiers' attitudes toward American paratroopers evolved. Initial dismissiveness, viewing them as inexperienced boys loaded with unnecessary luxuries, gave way to wary respect. German after-action reports noted that while they had little regard for the fighting qualities of the average American infantryman, they respected the elite nature of US paratroopers and rangers. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were volunteers, specially trained, and they fought with unexpected ferocity. But even this respect carried undertones of confusion. How could forces so poorly deployed, so obviously disadvantaged by their scattered drop, fight so effectively? Part of the answer lay in American training philosophy. Unlike German paratroopers, who were Luftwaffe troops and received extensive jump training as part of their identity, American airborne forces were essentially elite infantry who happened to arrive by parachute. The jump was a delivery method, not the core of their identity. Subtle distinction mattered. German Fallschirmjäger had been largely grounded since Crete, used as elite infantry, but rarely making combat jumps. When they did jump, as in Operation Stürzer during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the results were often disastrous because the jump itself had become a specialized skill divorced from ground combat. Reality. American paratroopers trained relentlessly for the ground combat that would follow the jump. Small unit tactics, leadership at every level. Adaptability. The expectation that plans would fail and improvisation would be necessary. This philosophy, born partly from necessity, the US, had less time to develop airborne doctrine than Germany proved more effective than the German approach when plans actually did collapse. The broader strategic context reveals how the scattered American airborne assault fit into Operation Overlord's success. The Allies had implemented an elaborate deception campaign called Operation Fortitude, designed to convince Germans that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion would come at Calais. Everything from fake radio traffic to dummy tank divisions to double agents fed German intelligence false information. The scattered airborne drop, paradoxically, reinforced this deception. German officers, looking at reports of paratroopers spread across 40 miles of countryside, reasoned that this couldn't possibly be the main effort. A serious airborne operation would concentrate forces at key objectives. This dispersed mess looked exactly like what it was, a disaster. Therefore, many Germans concluded, it must be a diversionary attack. The real invasion would come later, at Calais, with properly concentrated forces. This misreading bought the Allies precious time. Panzer divisions held in reserve near Calais remained there for days after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that never came. By the time German High Command accepted that Normandy was the main effort, Allied forces had established an unbreakable lodgment. The scattered paratroopers contributed to this deception without intending to. Their chaos looked like incompetence to German planners who couldn't imagine chaos could be tactically effective. Hitler's personal command style amplified German paralysis. The Führer had centralized control of reserve divisions, requiring his personal authorization for their deployment. On the morning of June 6th, Hitler was asleep. No one dared wake him to authorize release of panzer divisions. By the time Hitler woke and gave authorization mid-afternoon on June 6th, the opportunity for a devastating counterattack had passed. Allied forces were ashore in strength, naval gunfire dominated the coastal zone, and air superiority made large-scale German troop movements suicidal in daylight. The Germans did manage one significant armoured thrust, the 21st Panzer Division's attack toward the beaches between the British and Canadian landing zones. But even this was disrupted by fear of airborne forces. When British gliders arrived in massive numbers at 9 p.m. on June 6th, reinforcing the airborne bridgehead east of the Orne River, German commanders feared additional drops in their rear. The 21st Panzer withdrew. The spectre of Allied airborne forces, even when those forces were scattered, undersupplied, and struggling to organize, exerted psychological pressure far beyond their actual combat power. The human cost of the American airborne assault demands recognition. By the end of D-Day alone, approximately 2,500 American paratroopers and glider infantry had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Some sources suggest the number was even higher when including men who drowned, died of exposure, or were captured in isolated pockets. In the 82nd Airborne, 15 of 16 battalion commanders in the infantry regiments became casualties on June 6th. These were experienced officers, many veterans of Sicily and Italy, lost in a single day of combat. The 101st Airborne, making its first combat jump, suffered similar losses. Over the following 33 days of fighting in Normandy, the 101st lost more than 2,000 men killed and nearly 8,000 wounded, with 350 taken prisoner. The 82nd suffered comparable casualties over its 33 days in Normandy, before returning to England on July 13th. These losses were staggering, over 50% casualties in just over a month of combat. Yet the divisions accomplished their missions and established themselves as elite units in U.S. Army history. Individual stories reveal the brutal reality behind these statistics. Private John Steele, who hung from the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église for 2 hours, survived the war, but carried psychological scars from watching his fellow paratroopers shot as they descended or struggled to free themselves from their parachutes. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, who led the assault on Purple Heart Lane toward Carentan, received the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 11th. He would be killed by a German sniper 3 months later near Best, Holland, during Operation Market Garden. The French civilian population also paid a terrible price. Within the first 24 hours of the invasion, approximately 3,000 French civilians died in the invasion zone, caught between Allied bombardment and German defensive fire, or killed in the crossfire of close-quarters combat in villages and towns. The liberation of France was not cost-free for the French themselves. Carentan, Sainte-Mère-Église, Saint-Côme-du-Mont. These towns were battlefields before they were liberated territories. Buildings were destroyed, infrastructure damaged, civilians killed or displaced. Yet the French who survived greeted American paratroopers as liberators. After 4 years of German occupation, after the deprivations and humiliations of Nazi rule, even the destruction accompanying liberation was preferable to continued occupation. One account described French citizens in Carentan emerging from hiding after the Germans withdrew, bringing out bottles of wine that had been hidden from the occupiers. This image, French civilians sharing precious wine with exhausted, bloodied American paratroopers, captures something essential about the meaning of D-Day beyond tactics and strategy. The German forces opposing the American airborne assault also suffered devastating losses. The 91st Luftlande Infantry Division reported 2,200 casualties by June 12th, with an estimated 5,000 by July 23rd. After the second week of the invasion, the 91st had suffered so many casualties it was no longer considered combat effective as a unit. By June 26th, when Cherbourg surrendered, the 91st Division had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent formation. It had been reduced to a battle group and absorbed into other units. Von der Heydt's 6th Parachute Regiment suffered similarly. The elite formation that had entered battle with 4,500 men was reduced to company-sized elements within weeks. By early July, companies that should have numbered 120 men consisted of 30 to 40 troops, a combination of battle-tested Fallschirmjäger and young replacements standing shoulder to shoulder. One German soldier, Obergefreiter Gerd Schwetling of the 6th Company, recalled the regiment's later battles. Major von der Heyte reorganized the companies so that battle-experienced Fallschirmjäger would be standing shoulder to shoulder with the young boys. Nevertheless, the companies were not more than 30 to 40 men. The mathematics of attrition were brutal. The 6th Parachute Regiment, considered among Germany's finest formations, was ground down to a fraction of its strength in less than 2 months of fighting. Individual soldiers fought with determination, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental material and numerical superiority of Allied forces. The 100th Panzer Replacement and Training Battalion, attached to the 91st Division and equipped with captured French tanks, was effectively destroyed in its first major engagement. On June 13th, the 82nd Airborne launched an offensive against these Butterpanzers, captured enemy tanks despite having no armour support themselves. Men charging tanks. But in the bocage, the dense Norman hedgerow country, the tactic worked. The 100th Panzer Battalion lost approximately 15 tanks destroyed or captured in that action. Its last functioning vehicle, a Panzer Mark III, was destroyed on June 19th near Prato. The battalion was dissolved on July 1st. This engagement revealed another dimension of airborne success, the American willingness to take risks that conventional military wisdom would reject. Paratroopers attacking tanks without armour support defied doctrine. But in the close confines of hedgerow country, where visibility was measured in dozens of yards and tanks became vulnerable to close assault, it worked. The aftermath of the American airborne assault on D-Day extended far beyond Normandy. The operational success, despite the catastrophic scattering, validated large-scale airborne operations and led directly to subsequent jumps. Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France in August 1944, included airborne drops. Operation Market Garden, in September 1944, the largest airborne operation in history, until that point attempted to seize bridges across the Rhine. Operation Varsity in March 1945 supported the crossing of the Rhine. Each of these operations built on lessons learned in Normandy. Better pathfinder techniques, improved aircraft navigation, more realistic drop zone selection, market. Garden's failure, particularly at Arnhem, stemmed from strategic miscalculation rather than technical problems with the airborne assault itself. The Normandy experience also influenced post-war military doctrine. The US Army maintained multiple airborne divisions through the Cold War, recognizing that the ability to rapidly deploy elite infantry behind enemy lines remained strategically valuable. But perhaps the most significant legacy was psychological. The Normandy paratroopers demonstrated that even when plans collapse, when forces are scattered and isolated, determined soldiers with initiative can accomplish missions through improvisation and sheer will. This lesson proved applicable far beyond airborne operations. In an era when military planners could envision nuclear warfare making detailed planning obsolete within minutes, the ability to adapt and function when command structures failed became paramount. The scattered American paratroopers became a model for decentralized operations, what would later be called mission-type orders in military doctrine. Rather than requiring detailed instructions for every contingency, commanders at every level needed to understand the mission's intent and adapt as circumstances changed. Von der Heyde's own story provides a coda that illuminates the broader tragedy of the German perspective. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, von der Heyde was given command of Kampfgruppe von der Heyde for Operation Stoesser, the only nighttime combat parachute jump the Germans attempted during the war. His mission was to drop behind American lines, seize a crucial crossroads north of Malmedy, and hold it for approximately 24 hours until relieved by the 12th SS Panzer Division. Von der Heyde requested his own 6th Parachute Regiment for the mission. He was refused, moving his regiment might alert allies to the impending offensive. Instead, he received 800 men contributed by various regiments. Rather than sending their best troops, many units sent misfits and troublemakers. Von der Heydte later commented, "Never in my entire career had I been in command of a unit with less fighting spirit." The mission was rushed. Von der Heydte had 8 days to prepare. Many of his men had never jumped from an airplane before. The Ju-52 pilots were inexperienced, many having never flown in combat or conducted drops at night. The jump was a disaster. High winds and inexperienced pilots scattered the force across the Ardennes. Some paratroopers landed behind German lines. Others landed 50 miles from the intended drop zone. Initially, only 125 men reached the correct landing zone without heavy weapons. Von der Heydte eventually rounded up 300 troops, but without sufficient ammunition for sustained combat. Because all radios were destroyed in the jump, von der Heydte didn't know the 12th SS Panzer Division had failed to break through American lines and couldn't relieve him. Cut off, without supplies, pursued by US forces, von der Heydte ordered his men to break through in small groups and reach German lines. He broke his arm in the jump. By December 23rd, the pain from his shattered forearm and injured shoulder became unbearable. He ordered his companions to leave him. Entering Monschau alone, he rested in a local house for 2 days before asking a resident to contact the Americans. Von der Heydte, commander of the only German nighttime combat parachute jump in history, surrendered. The irony was complete. The German officer who had faced scattered American paratroopers in Normandy and watched them succeed despite chaos, now experienced his own catastrophic airborne operation. Operation Stoesser failed to achieve any of its objectives. Yet the mere presence of German paratroopers behind American lines caused alarm and forced US commanders to divert resources to secure their rear. Even in failure, even scattered and ineffective, airborne forces exerted psychological pressure disproportionate to their actual combat power. Von der Heydte understood this. In American captivity, he discussed his experiences openly with interrogators. His post-war academic career included analysis of airborne operations, and his writings contributed to U.S. military doctrine in the 1950s. He survived the war. Many of his men, both those who fought in Normandy and those who jumped in the Ardennes, did not. The question that frames this story, why did the Wehrmacht laugh at American airborne paratroopers only to be stunned by them, has a complex answer that goes beyond simple miscalculation. The Germans didn't underestimate American paratroopers because they were ignorant. Von der Heydte was an experienced airborne commander. German intelligence knew about Allied airborne divisions, their training, their equipment. The Wehrmacht understood the theory of airborne operations as well as anyone. What the Germans failed to understand was how American forces would respond when theory collapsed into chaos. German military culture emphasized order, discipline, adherence to plans. When plans failed, German units struggled to adapt. They waited for new orders, sought to re-establish command structures, and attempted to impose order on chaos. American military culture, particularly in elite units like the Airborne Divisions, emphasized individual initiative within the commander's intent. When plans failed, American soldiers adapted. They formed ad hoc units, identified alternative objectives, and improvised solutions. This cultural difference wasn't absolute. German soldiers were certainly capable of initiative, and American units sometimes froze when faced with unexpected situations. But at the institutional level, the US military in World War II created systems that encouraged and rewarded adaptation, while the German military created systems that emphasized obedience and adherence to doctrine. The scattered airborne drop on D-Day revealed this difference in stark terms. The Americans succeeded not despite their chaos, but, paradoxically, in part because of it. The scattered drop that should have doomed them created opportunities for initiative that more organized German forces couldn't counter. The Wehrmacht laughed if they did because they couldn't imagine chaos being tactically effective. They were stunned because 13,000 scattered paratroopers accomplished what seemed impossible. They helped establish and secure the western flank of the largest amphibious invasion in history. On the morning of June 7, 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower visited Utah Beach. The supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe walked among the troops who had landed the previous day, spoke with officers coordinating the push inland, and observed the continuous stream of men and materiel flowing across the beaches. Inland, scattered American paratroopers were still assembling, still fighting isolated engagements in hedgerows and villages, still trying to link up with their units or accomplish missions with whatever forces they'd gathered. The invasion had succeeded. The Atlantic Wall was breached. The liberation of Western Europe had begun, and 13,000 American paratroopers, dropped in darkness into chaos, had played an essential role in that success, not by executing their plan perfectly, but by adapting when that plan collapsed, by fighting when isolated, by taking initiative when command structures failed. They were young men, mostly around 20 years old. They carried too much equipment, jumped from planes into walls of anti-aircraft fire, landed in the wrong places, drowned in shallow marshes, and fought confused battles in darkness against an enemy that should have defeated them in detail. Instead, they won. The German forces that opposed them, elite Fallschirmjäger, motivated infantry, experienced commanders fought with skill and determination. But they fought according to a doctrine that couldn't adapt to an enemy who refused to be destroyed by their own disorganization. In the end, the story of the American airborne assault on D-Day isn't about perfect execution or brilliant planning. It's about resilience, about improvisation under impossible circumstances, about soldiers who, when everything went wrong, refused to accept defeat. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson the hard way, in Norman hedgerows and flooded fields, in shattered communications networks and confused defensive positions, in the gradual realization that the scattered enemy they'd expected to defeat piece by piece was somehow accomplishing its objectives despite overwhelming disadvantages. 13,000 men behind enemy lines, scattered and isolated, turned chaos into a weapon and helped change the course of the Second World War. That's the profound irony at the heart of this story. The drop that failed succeeded. The disaster became a victory, and the Germans who watched it unfold could only wonder how forces so obviously disadvantaged achieved what seemed impossible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.